Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive.
Always exciting to be back.
And today we're diving into the world of canine genetics.
One of my favorite worlds.
Specifically looking at a study about paroxysmal dyskinesia.
PXD, for short.
Or PXD in Norwich Terriers. You know, it's really interesting how this condition, which is characterized by these sudden episodes of involuntary movements, actually mirrors similar presentations that we see in humans.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
A previous study had already hinted at a potential, hereditary link in these dogs. But this 2024 study by Jenkins and their team really takes it a step further.
They did.
It tries to actually map out the genetic roots of PXD.
That's right.
Using something called a Genome-wide association study.
Yep.
A GWAS.
GWAS.
So could you tell us a little bit more about what this study focused on and how they went about it?
Yeah, so this study was really focused on identifying genetic variations that are associated with PXD in Norwich Terriers. And to do this, they analyzed 24 affected dogs and 24 unaffected dogs. And they made sure that all of these dogs were over 6 years old. And they used a tool called the Axiom Canine HD Array.
Wow.
Yeah. And this tool allows them to scan the entire genome for single nucleotide polymorphisms.
Oh, wow.
Or SNPs. Which are essentially just single letter changes in the DNA sequence.
Interesting.
That might be linked to the disease.
So they're trying to see, if there's, a common thread in the DNA.
Yep, they're looking for those genetic differences. That could explain why some dogs develop TXD and others don't.
Makes sense. And they actually went a step further, right?
They did.
They incorporated data from a separate study. That was on Norwich Terriers with upper airway syndrome.
Yes.
And as it turned out, this study also included some dogs with PXD. So it's like they were trying to put together this complex genetic puzzle.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it.
So how did they actually visualize these findings?
So figure 1 visually represents their findings. And this is something that's called a Manhattan plot. Which is very common in GWS studies.
Got it.
And it shows the statistical significance of each SNP's association with PXD. Each dot represents a SNP, and its position on the axis reflects the strength of the association. So the higher the dot, the stronger the association.
I see.
The lower the dot, the weaker the association.
Makes sense.
And so by looking at this Manhattan plot, we can start to get a sense of which SNPs might be most important in PXD.
So based on that figure, did they actually pinpoint any super strong suspects?
So that's where things get really interesting because no single SNP actually reached the threshold for what we call genome-wide significance.
Oh, wow.
And this suggests that PXD in Norwich Terriers is likely not a simple single-gene disorder, but potentially a more complex trait involving multiple genes or even gene interactions.
So maybe not as straightforward as we initially hoped.
Right, exactly. It's not just one gene, one disease situation.
Right, but I mean, even though it wasn't that simple answer, it seems like they did find some pretty interesting clues along the way.
Absolutely.
So can you walk us through some of those?
Yeah, so Table 1 highlights the top 8 SNPs from their analysis. And these SNPs showed what we call a suggestive level of association with PXD. Even though they didn't quite hit that genome-wide significance threshold. And some of these SNPs are located within or near genes with functions that could plausibly be related to neurological processes.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so for example, one of these SNPs is near a gene called SIK3. And SIK3 is involved in intracellular signaling pathways. So it helps cells communicate with each other. And then another SNP is near a gene called FCHSD2. And FCHSD2 is thought to be involved in cell membrane function. So it helps to maintain the integrity of the cell membrane.
So we're already starting to see these potential connections between these SNPs and the intricate workings of the nervous system.
Absolutely.
Which is really cool.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it was so smart of them to incorporate that data from the upper airway syndrome study. Right? Because it's they were trying to boost their signal.
Exactly. They were trying to increase their statistical power by adding more dogs to the analysis.
And remind me again, how many more dogs did they add?
So they added 10 more PXD cases and 45 more controls.
Wow. So that's a substantial number.
Yeah, it's a good chunk of dogs. And they also made sure to check for something called population stratification. And they did this using figure S1, which basically confirmed that the two groups of dogs, the ones from the original study and the ones from the upper airway syndrome study, were genetically similar enough for comparison.
So they weren't like completely different populations?
Exactly.
Okay, good.
So they could actually combine the data.
Okay, great. And did this additional data actually like lead them to anything?
It did.
Okay.
So when they combined the data sets, two SNPs within the SIK3 and FCHSD2 genes showed a stronger association with PXD.
Oh, wow.
Although they still fell short of that genome-wide significance.
Okay.
So close, but not quite a slam dunk.
Right. So it's like they're getting warmer.
Yeah, exactly.
There's still something else that's preventing them from like hitting the jackpot.
And there's also a really interesting twist
what's so
with the FCHSD2 SNP.
Okay.
The risk allele. So the one that's associated with an increased likelihood of PXD was completely absent in the added cases and controls from the upper airway syndrome study. And in fact, it was incredibly rare even within the larger upper airway syndrome data set.
That's strange.
Yeah, it is.
So what could that mean?
Well, that's the burning question, isn't it?
It is.
It certainly adds another layer of complexity to this whole genetic puzzle.
Absolutely.
They also did this thing called a meta-analysis, which is basically a statistical technique that combines data from multiple studies to increase statistical power.
Got it.
And the details of this analysis are outlined in Appendix S1.
Okay.
And the results are presented in Figure S2.
Okay, so did this fancy meta-analysis give them any, like, clearer answers?
Unfortunately, no, it didn't reveal any genome-wide significant associations either. So this further underscores that complexity of PXD in Norwich Terriers. And it really suggests that there are multiple genetic and perhaps even environmental factors that are likely involved.
Okay, so what does this all actually mean for Norwich Terriers and their owners?
Well, it means we need to start thinking beyond that simple one-gene model. For PXD. The study's findings suggest that it's more likely a multifaceted condition, potentially influenced by multiple genes or even interactions between genes and the environment.
So we shouldn't necessarily expect a simple genetic test to definitively diagnose PXD in these dogs anytime soon.
That's the crux of the matter. The absence of a single, highly significant genetic marker suggests that PXD diagnosis will likely remain a clinical one based on a combination of the dog's history, their clinical signs, and a really careful neurological examination.
So it really is a puzzle.
Yeah.
So if there isn't this like single gene to target, what does that mean for treatment and management of PXD?
That is where things get even more interesting, I think.
Oh, how so?
If PXD is indeed this complex trait influenced by multiple factors, it suggests that a more personalized approach to management might be necessary.
Okay, what do you mean by personalized?
So it could mean recognizing that different dogs might have different underlying genetic and environmental risk factors that contribute to their PXD. And this could, in turn, influence their response to different treatment approaches.
So you're saying like a one-size-fits-all approach might not be the most effective?
Precisely.
Okay.
Future research might focus on identifying subgroups of PXD patients based on their genetic profiles or specific environmental triggers. This could pave the way for more targeted and effective treatment strategies.
So really honing in on what's going on with each individual dog to figure out the best way to help them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really is fascinating to think about how this research could potentially benefit not just dogs, but humans too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like you were saying earlier, those shared pathways. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it really highlights the power of comparative medicine, you know, looking at different species to try to understand these complex diseases.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We started out talking about genes. And now we're talking about the environment and even like the bigger picture implications for human health.
It's all connected.
It really is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there a final thought that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think the big takeaway here, given the lack of that single smoking gun gene, is that PXD in Norwich Terriers is really this complex interplay of genetic predisposition and environmental triggers.
Like that delicate dance between nature and nurture.
Exactly.
That we always talk about.
Yeah, and this understanding, I think, really underscores the need for a more holistic approach to PXD management.
What do you mean by that?
So it's not just about identifying those genes that are involved, but also understanding how environmental factors might influence the expression of those genes and the onset of symptoms.
So future research should really focus on identifying those specific triggers.
Yes, absolutely.
Like you mentioned, diet, stress, exposure to toxins.
All of those things could play a role.
And I think this knowledge would be so empowering for owners and veterinarians to really take proactive steps to minimize those triggers.
Right.
And ultimately improve the quality of life for these dogs that are affected.
It's all about trying to give them the best life possible.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into the world of PXD and Norwich Terriers.
That's my pleasure.
From Vet Neurojar, keep those minds-inspired hearts light and tails wagging.